John, we understand we can start. We are live.
Good afternoon, everyone in the East, the UK, and good morning to those in the Americas over on the West Coast. So I'd like to welcome everybody to what I'm expecting to be a very lively discussion, urban redevelopment for improved urban climate and environment. So we've got a fabulous panel here, three of us, and so it's going to be a quick round. We've got a bunch of questions. And by the way, I'm John Hughes. Some of you may remember me as past president of RICS. So I'm in Toronto, and I'm a urban development municipal finance person. So I've got a bit of a background in this, but we've really got a great panel. And the first person up is Bagaeen, who has a multitude of skills. He is the director with Arcadis of the environmental planning team, but he also is a prof of planning and resilient systems at the University of Kent. And I don't know how he squeezes this in. He's also a local government councillor, and so he's got lots of skills. And I'm going to kick off by asking you, Samir, you know, what are the appropriate, how do we drive change? How do we drive climate change through regeneration projects? And I suppose more importantly, as well, how do we actually get the skill set? How do we get the people to do that? So kick us off quickly with that question.
Brilliant. Thank you, John, and hi everybody. So it's an interesting one because I think it's something that cuts across a whole lot of areas of work, whether you are in regeneration, whether you are in local government, if you are in education, for example, higher and further education particularly, or if you are even in independent sectors, you know, things like culture, so skills are needed across the board, and growing skills is a tough one because, you know, and I suspect where you are, if you think about it, you know, particularly if you have regeneration projects going, you know, one of the first things you'd be looking at is, do you have the right skilled labor to undertake the project? Do you have the right planning expertise? Do you have the right surveying expertise? Do you have enough architects? Do you have enough engineers? And this is where universities, for example, come in. You know, because universities are in the job particularly of training people in the built environment professions who will take on these projects. So, but they can't do that on their own. They need to work in partnership. So what we've done is, and I'm speaking to you from a local government building in Kent, in the southeast of England. So we've been working very closely as a university of Kent, in Kent, working with chief executives, working with directors of place, directors of planning, directors of regeneration, to not only build the skills capacity they need, but also to kind of explore that future pipeline of projects and map that against the future pipeline of talent that they will need. Because we are at the moment talking about projects, you know, particularly here, for example, major road infrastructure that are going to be open to the public in 2030. You know, so we're not necessarily talking about the skills to deliver these projects now. We are talking about the skills to design them now and to make sure that we can deliver them, but then also to make sure that they are effectively maintained and so on. And you've got all sorts of stuff coming on board, from data to modeling to the resilience of infrastructure, that are absolutely critical now and in 10 years' time when these projects come online. But it's partnership work across the board between universities, the public sector, the private sector, and education providers across the board to deliver these. Yeah.
And presumably changing somewhat with climate change. As climate change, it's got to influence that training.
Absolutely, and that's built in. So the climate education training is already built into curriculums, particularly with the RICS accredited programs and other accredited programs, but also you've got programs embedding things like sustainable urban drainage now, so that they are effective in 2030 when these projects open.
That's great. I'm going to jump now to Professor Liz Varga, who's at the University College London, and she heads the Collaboratorium for Research in Infrastructure and Cities. And I suppose more importantly, what she says is she's passionate about improving infrastructure, but basically for the good of society, and I suppose particularly in these times. So, Liz, I'm going to ask you how can infrastructure be used to regenerate it for regeneration and helping with climate mitigation? I mean, this is a huge issue, and I'm just sort of interested in your take on that aspect.
Okay, so thanks, John, for the question. It's great to be here at this event. Thank you so much for inviting me. So to look at this question, I mean, there are so many aspects to it, because we're worried about regeneration, because we obviously know we're not building infrastructure at a fast enough rate to provide for all the demand that we're getting. But we know that as we build infrastructure, we're of course contributing to climate change. We're creating more embodied carbon into our built assets, into our built environment, and therefore creating more pollution and less ability for the environment to cope. Therefore, climate change is in this positive feedback loop where we're spiraling and we're making the environment worse. So everything we have to do for infrastructure has to be even better. Now, it's not just a challenge with the climate, this cycle of climate positive feedback. It's also that existing infrastructure isn't up to the current demands of climate performance right now. So we already have to improve and regenerate our infrastructure so that it can cope with our current situation. And as I say, we're not building fast enough. We also have the exacerbated movement of people into cities. Now, it's like a two-sided thing. It can be a good thing if we increase the intensity of demand, because it means that we can utilize our infrastructure better. But of course, the quality of the infrastructure has to be improved so that it can manage that increased intensification of demand. People will know these statistics that by 2050, 70% of the world's population will be in urban areas. So there are so many things we need to do to regenerate the infrastructure in cities and in towns and all scales of urban areas, so that we can actually cope with this constant demand on climate. I just want to add also about the rehabilitation and reinforcement of infrastructure, that we also need to be careful about the selection of the materials and the processes that we use for that, because they can also lead to more climate impact. So we've got to be careful on choices. We have to think circular economy, of course, and about reuse of materials. And then when we do implement adaptations, to make sure that they're more modular so that we can decommission at end of life and reuse high value components. And of course, if we can avoid building grey infrastructure and use green or blue infrastructure instead, even better.
Great. That's a great introduction. It's a very good lead-in, actually, to Kathy Michell, who's an associate professor at the University of Cape Town, and she heads. She's director of sustainability-oriented and cyber research for the built environment at Cape Town University. And I'm going to actually move in a little bit different direction with you, Kathy, and asking you. It's not just a question of the project itself. I mean, it's the stakeholders. So who are the stakeholders that we need to really deal with in helping move forward these, sustainable regeneration projects?
Thank you, John. And hello, everybody. Really super to be here. And thank you for the invitation. That's a really complex question, John, because it depends on the context of the urban environment that you are practicing as a chartered surveyor. I think if you're in the developed world, it's particularly different compared to where I sit in the developing world, where the majority of the urbanization predicted for the next 10 to 15 years is actually in the developing world. So the key stakeholders, I think, for me, traditionally in terms of planning of urban regeneration, we've looked specifically to the planning profession. But the planning profession obviously have laid out the plans of cities. But in Africa, certainly we have this dichotomy of the informal sector and the formal sector actually rubbing shoulders and moving together. So in many ways, it's actually time for the stakeholders to actually work collaboratively. And those stakeholders are not only government, it's our built environment professions, of which we are proud members as the RICS, but particularly actually the local communities, the local population upon which these developments or urban regenerations actually have a direct impact. So one of the questions I would encourage surveyors to be thinking about is how do we actually leverage that regeneration that we so desperately need without enforcing economic displacement of local communities that are well established in particular areas? Because for us, the social cohesiveness of our African cities is actually more critical in many ways than the economic and the environmental. If we don't get our social issues right in cities in developing or emerging economies, we're not going to achieve or leverage the economic and the subsequent environmental outcomes.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many examples we see, I suppose, across the world of well-established, lower density communities that get displaced when you get intensification in order to accommodate, the growing urban populations. And it's obvious in places like South Africa, but we see it both here and it's happened in the past here. So that's a really good point, is that challenge. The old argument about, you may have to break a few eggs to make the omelet. And I'm not sure that the delicate balance, that's the issue, I suppose, Kathy.
Yeah, I mean, if you can get the community to actually help you break the eggs, then you have a fantastic omelet.
Right.
As opposed to an enforced breaking of the eggs onto the community, if we can use that analogy.
Yeah.
So I'm arguing, I think that if you're moving into an urban area where the primary concern of that local community is putting food on the table, then one actually needs to be very aware. In fact, you actually have a moral and ethical responsibility as a built environment professional to be very aware of the local context and the local socioeconomic circumstances of a community within which you're actually driving an urban regeneration or development project. So I think it's time for collaboration between the private sector and the developer and local government in terms of driving those regeneration projects. That way, I firmly believe we can actually leverage the three pillars of sustainability that we actually need to achieve.
Yeah, and I suppose maybe I'll take this back to Liz, and because we are in a sense taking this sort of ESG issue, and obviously there's the E is the climate change, but the S is a crucial thing, and I'm wondering can the rehabilitation, can the regeneration projects improve social impacts? And I suppose it's, some of these infrastructure projects are hugely significant, but I'm wondering, Liz, what's your take on that? What is can they in fact improve social outcomes?
Yeah, no, and I think this is a really important point that you make here, John, because we need to connect the inputs, if you like, into our infrastructure operations and adaptations, so that they not only achieve outcomes in terms of, better performing infrastructure, but that they also lead to the right environmental and social outcomes. I mean, in particular for buildings, there's a massive challenge that buildings aren't really fit for good social outcomes. Often they're poorly insulated, there's poor ventilation. We have some very sad cases even of deaths when there's the conditions are just so inadequate in buildings. But we also have many disused buildings. In the UK, about three or 4 years ago, we had over 600,000 empty buildings, and about 2/3 of those were residential buildings. It's a massive problem that if we could rehabilitate, refurbish these buildings up to a standard that provides good quality of life for the occupants, increases their ability to work, reduces the strain on national health systems, and gives people that ability to be part of society, because they're healthy and fit. They become active members of society. It also creates, more competition in terms of, rent or mortgage payments, because if you have a larger building stock, it drives better social outcomes in terms of lower cost. But obviously the quality of life is the key thing to this. And I just want to mention that there are, of course, several challenges to rehabilitation and obviously also repair of buildings, because sometimes the structures of buildings are unsound, and therefore that's the cause for not using buildings fully. And the structural unsoundness can often be driven not by climate change, but rather by the human negligence aspect of engineering, where we've cut costs and we've missed observations about the condition of the buildings. So there's a lot to be done in terms of monitoring and remedial action that's timely. And this is the main barrier, is how quickly can we regenerate, and how quickly can we sort of get over the barriers to regeneration. And although we want to comply, obviously, with especially things like fire regulations, we want to make buildings safe for their occupants, but we need to speed up the rate at which we regenerate, because our new building stock isn't coming on board fast enough to meet the needs of the climate and the society.
Yeah, it's that's a really good point. In Toronto, there's an architect here who's been a real advocate for recladding of the existing high-rise stock of buildings, because Toronto is just packed with them. But from an energy point of view, they are really not up to snuff. So, rather than just sort of knocking them down, we need to regenerate that stuff. So I think that's a good point. Have you got any other examples? And I'm thinking maybe, obviously the buildings that people live in is one thing. To what extent do you think that there's other projects that, infrastructure projects that are, addressing the issue of climate change? And
it's a massive subject in the infrastructure world. Climate resilience is like one of the biggest challenges that we're facing. We need to be sure that our infrastructure going forward can face the greater demands of, more frequent and more intense hazards. And obviously the anthropogenic change that we're creating as consumers of infrastructure services is all adding to that climate cycle. So, but there are examples of where we do see roads are being produced to better quality. There's protection on railway lines, water systems, and energy systems, of course, that are being reinforced to higher design levels. But it's only when they are up for reinforcement, and that program of works can take many years. And so we're in this situation where we're uncertain as to when the infrastructure may fail in that interim period. So we have to monitor, we have to do condition-based maintenance and assessment, but the regeneration and rehabilitation refurbishment is a massive program that we just have to pay so much more attention to than we've done in the past.
Yeah, and maybe I'm going to come back to Kathy. We've talked about what needs to be done, but one of the key things is, it's all well and good to just do these projects, but I think so important the question of, benchmarking and in a sense, measuring how well we're doing. What are the appropriate benchmarks that we can use to determine sustainable outcomes from these regeneration projects? It seems to me a vital thing, but what do you see on that, Kathy?
Okay, so maybe I can be a little controversial. The existing Green Building Council.
We love controversy.
Okay, good. Then I'll be a true academic and stir the pot. The current Green Building Council related rating tools that most of the private sector would use. So I'm talking about the most common globally probably are LEED and BREEAM, but there are lots all over the world. tend to be designed from a top-down approach. So they're very design-orientated and philosophically come from a position that argues this is new build as opposed to regeneration, number one. Number two, they tend to focus on very hard metrics of, energy performance, water consumption, cycle tracks, that kind of thing. They tend less to focus on the social outcomes. You can see my leaning from my earlier question. For us, what we are finding the most useful is actually to try and work with developers to align or map their projects and their regeneration or redevelopment or even new development projects to the UN Habitat's 17 SDGs. In particular, SDG Goal 11, which is around sustainable cities. When you go into that, it is possible to actually leverage a lot against the 17 SDGs in one redevelopment or regeneration project. And if you start to work on that, then we, maybe, I know what industry and government want is a hard metric that you can actually put your hands around. So it is still research in progress. The development of a neighborhood assessment sustainability framework that is grassroots up, if you know what I mean. So it actually works from the community up. So it's very contextual in terms of looking at a local community and what would be the most appropriate sustainability metrics that we can apply into that local neighborhood that is very clearly aligned with the 17 SDGs. And that then pulls in even, Liz's work in terms of the infrastructure. It pulls in the social sustainability, and obviously very strong focus on water sustainability, for us anyway, water sustainability and energy sustainability.
Right.
Yeah. So I would recommend aligning your development projects with the 17 SDGs. If you're able to map your development project to that, I think you're achieving the three outcomes that you need.
Yeah. Actually, sort of Samir, I'm sure, has been sitting there ready to jump in on this, and I maybe we'll come back to this a bit, because I'm going to actually raise a key part, and it actually, I'm not sure if anybody were on the calls earlier, or rather the earlier sessions. Greg Clark was talking about, decarbonizing the cities, and I suppose one of the finance part of it. I want to know, Samir, your take on what about the funding? What about the financing of all this regeneration work? I mean, it's all very well and good that we do this, but so many of the challenges, particularly around climate change, they're expensive to implement, and it's hard to get the returns in the short time frame that many people want to deal with. So I suppose we're sort of talking a little bit about green finance. So Samir, why don't you chip in on this, and we'll come back, I think, to the broader issues as well later.
Yeah, no, happy to jump in on that, John. I mean, Greg, I didn't listen to Greg's talk, but I suspect you would have flagged the work they're doing on the 3CI, that's the Cities Commission for Climate and Investment. And since it's a vehicle for marrying cities that need finance with the finance that's there are lots of opportunities for cities to access green finance if they wanted to. But I think one of the crucial challenges, as I find as I sit in local government, is cities don't necessarily know where to find that finance or that it exists. So I'll give you an example. Not that long ago, probably 2019, this is a year before lockdown, I offered to introduce a group of CEOs in local government to Sean Kidney, who runs the Climate Bonds Initiative, and have Sean kind of brief them on the options available to them to finance projects through green bonds and climate bonds. And they didn't know what those were. So in a sense, there is a level of knowledge in local government where I think we're in a situation where we probably got a 2 or 3 tier set of local government leaders and chief executives, where some are really engaged and really connected. And you'll see that from Greg's podcast, for example, which he's doing on the DNA of cities, where, all of the cities he has spoken to and will speak. I think he's done Istanbul and Glasgow, for example, where you have leadership which is very much engaged. There is, however, leadership which isn't necessarily engaged. And some of our UK cities, for example, they're quite willing and ready to sit back and wait for government grants to do stuff. But I think there probably is a greater need for cities to be more innovative in how they not only look at generating finance from their assets. A lot of cities have town halls that could easily be used to generate income for the town halls. A lot of We've got a few in Kent, for example, that have sold town halls and leased the space back, in effect, and creating in the act not only income but also more space for small businesses, SMEs, cultural sector to kind of come in and occupy space that it otherwise, since the pandemic, particularly underutilized. I mean, we've got town halls running at 20% space utilization, which is not really effective and not really climate efficient either. We have new tools. Last week, the all-party parliamentary group in the UK issued the Guide to Green Finance with the support of UK 100, which is a network of climate able leaders, and the GFI, the Green Finance Initiative, which in fact is a government body that's again meant to introduce green finance to local government. So we have tools, we have the environment. But I think for some cities and for some city leaders in particular, it's the ability to find time and space and knowledge and understanding, and then bring your political leadership on board, and then bring your leaders on board. Because in some places you'll find some of your residents are far ahead of where you are at the moment.
Yeah. It sort of comes to a broader question. I mean, I'll have your take on it, and then maybe we turn it back to Liz and Kathy. Are municipalities, local governments sufficient embracing the importance of changes into their whether it be building codes, into their planning codes? Are they really embracing the issue? Do they really get it yet, do you think? And does what about the private sector? Because so often it's the case, well, we'll sort of do it if we have to, but I'm not going to be the pioneer on it. So, I mean, where are we at on that? Are we actually going to see regeneration really reflecting the requirements that we're going to have with all of this climate change? I mean, I think of flooding in California. I think of the heat waves that we've been seeing, the risks of fire. All of those factors seem to me to have to be taken into account in a much better way than we've done in the past. I mean, quick view from you, and then maybe we'll get Kathy and Liz to respond on that point.
Yeah, no, and quick view, and you're right about California, for example. Everybody would be expecting heat waves, and nobody would have expected flooding, for example. It just shows how volatile the environment is. And in a sense, I think the private sector does recognize the need to respond and react. Certainly the professional bodies have. I mean, members of the RICS will know that, we have a royal charter, and we are obliged to act in the public interest. We will have policies and guidelines in the places we work, but actually the public interest is paramount. And you could easily argue the public interest at the moment calls for building climate resilience, not only to current shocks, but also to future shocks, and mitigate as much as we can against those. And part of that mitigation is, for example, if you're building new development, you're building substations to elevate them so that they are at lesser risk of flooding, to look at your railways and make sure they're future-proof. We got all sorts of problems on the railway, particularly in the UK, for example, if it rains, if it snows, if all sorts of things happen. There are all sorts of shocks and stresses that we could easily mitigate against if we wanted to. And all of those shocks and stresses have been mapped for various cities around the world, thanks to the good work of Rockefeller Foundation and ICLI and others, who over the years have actually mapped a lot of the shocks and stresses that cities suffer from, and in effect map solutions to these. So that's where the private sector is and the public sector is, and I think there is alignment generally.
Kathy, I mean, you're in an environment where you're a long way behind all the sort of nice, sophisticated stuff that places like the UK or the States can deal with. I mean, you've got much more fundamental issues to deal with, but how are they, where is climate change and all of those other requirements fitting in? Are you sort of leapfrogging past and actually embracing the needs and building those into the framework of construction and planning?
Yes and no. I think we are leapfrogging, obviously learning very quickly from what our developed world counterparts have already done. But probably our two biggest challenges at the moment are water and electricity, energy supply. I mean, as you know, Cape Town actually faced day zero a few years ago. So it's a very real threat. The water shortage is climate related. The electricity is a separate issue. That's our failing infrastructure across the country and an inability to supply electricity to the population. I think that both the private sector and government, local government anyway, are fully aware of those challenges, and new developments. There are very conscious efforts on the part of both development and government, local government, to ensure that new buildings anyway are not as reliant on the grid. The city of Cape Town anyway has a very strong strategy to be less and less reliant on what is our traditional supply mechanisms in terms of water and electricity, and are actively putting that in place. I think our biggest barrier is, if I can put it simply, as red tape, is institutional, legislative frameworks that actually constrain that free collaboration between local government and the private sector, and actually constrains the private sector in terms of actually doing, really sort of thinking outside the box, where we have office parks, for example, one particular office park here in Cape Town that's owned by one of the big property companies that produces an immense amount of electricity from solar panels on their roof. And they produce far in excess of what they actually need to run the office park on a daily basis, but they're not permitted to put that excess energy back into the grid because of legislation. And that's one of our biggest, I think that's a bigger constraint. I always say you'll be amazed what happens when you set humans free in terms of their ability to think outside the box and find solutions for their own personal challenges in their own backyard. And in some ways, government actually constrains that ability for communities to actually unlock their own potential. If you empower people, they will unlock their own potential. I firmly believe that. Yeah. A couple, actually, more an observation or a question. I mean, this is in terms of innovation. I mean, somebody asks about the role of hydrogen in terms of heating. I mean, obviously, we've got natural gas, and we're desperately trying to get rid of it. I mean, I have to say, I gave my gas stove away, and I've got an induction stove now. But I'm just wondering whether we're going to have to get rid of my gas furnace and go to electric, or we're using some other. Are we moving quickly in that direction? Do we feel? Is that something that, again, being allowed for? Are people planning for that and pushing for it? I don't know, you or Kathy or others.
I'm happy to jump in on this, John, because there's a group called Hydrogen Sussex, which meet down here on the south coast in England, and I sit on that. And that's effectively a collection of private sector, public sector, universities, local government, anyone interested in hydrogen. So there is a community evolving in that respect. And there are lots of conversations about what you do, where you invest. There are clear investment in hydrogen hubs appearing in the UK. The Northeast, for example, is a major hydrogen hub for the UK. There is a hydrogen plant being built in Canterbury district, not far from where I am at the moment. So the infrastructure is being developed. Hydrogen buses are effectively being geared up to run on the roads. There's a big effort to decarbonize and effectively run on hydrogen a lot of the shipping vessels and the maritime transport. But I think the question itself is the replacement of boilers or the replacement of gas in boilers with hydrogen. And I know we're phasing out gas boilers in new homes, I think from 2030 in the UK. It might vary from country to country. So that's still happening. But, the network, we are told, is geared up to do that. But I can't see any kind of clear line of sight where this will happen imminently. Like I said, the focus is on transport, particularly whether road or maritime. And that's where the major investment is going in at the moment.
Yeah. I'm wondering, Liz, I was going to ask you to jump. It looks as if you were about to anyway.
I was going to.
Go for it.
So I mean, there are several projects looking at the national grid to see how much hydrogen we can actually put through together with natural gas and how much is acceptable to existing boilers. And we don't know the percentage yet. We're certainly putting small percentages of hydrogen through already. But actually, how do you transform so that you actually move beyond that sort of 50% of hydrogen compared to natural gas? Right. And that's going to have consequences, of course, not just for the transmission and distribution reinforcement, but for the end end use systems as well, because they'll have to be run differently. So there's a whole industry out there to emerge on boiler reconfiguration for use of hydrogen compared to natural gas, so that we can prolong the life of existing equipment. Because of course we don't help ourselves with circular economy and climate change if we are forever replacing products. You know, we need to get the most life out of the products in our systems. But there's definitely investigations going on, and obviously safety is a massive thing here with hydrogen. So we've got to be sure that we're not going to compromise safety as part of that transition into green hydrogen. We don't want blue hydrogen, thank you very much, which is just natural gas transformed into hydrogen. So we have to be very clear it's green hydrogen, which is coming from renewable sources. So yeah, let's make sure we're talking about the same thing as well.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I mean, we talked at this session was talked about as giving us some real concrete examples, and I'm wondering if we can go around the table here and if you got some really some projects that you really feel are encouraging, it would be helpful. And I don't know whether I want to put Liz on the spot or Kathy or
yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Yeah, so actually it's not a project, it's more a reflection of an incident from about 25 years ago, and it's a really sad incident. I'm sure people have heard of this one before. So this is the Mont Blanc tunnel fire. Now this killed nearly 40 people, I believe. This was a truck that was moving food goods, so it had margarine and other sorts of groceries on the truck. It got stuck inside the it was in the tunnel only a few minutes before a spark caused this ignition. Now the consequences are that obviously there was a loss of life because the fire couldn't be controlled, but actually people couldn't get out because the infrastructure hadn't been carefully rehabilitated to provide those exit routes and to provide the clean air that people need during the time until people can get in to stop the fire. So the lesson here is about the accountability of the people that are operating these systems, whether they're tunnels, bridges, buildings. The accountability is the thing that's coming to the fore. And the person there had an imprisonment sentence. So therefore it was deemed a criminal activity of negligence. So therefore we now have this onus, and we don't want to use sticks like that to say, you know, you have to do this, but actually you're ethically and morally obliged to do the right thing. So therefore we ought to. So it's not a good example, but it's an example that could lead to the right outcomes.
Yeah. I'm wondering, Kathy, have you got a more uplifting example, or Samir? I mean, that's a rather grim note.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
No, there are. I mean, there's a lot of you, and there will be surveyors on the call, for example, in planning and development, who are kind of working on a whole lot of stuff. One of the big things that is gearing up to get a lot of investment in a UK context, at least, is sustainable urban drainage, so SUDS. A lot of our utility companies, for example, and there's a few down here in the southeast corner, whether it's Southern Water or Thames Water or United Utilities, who are investing billions, not millions. So in fact, between the three of them, about £6 billion in sustainable urban drainage to effectively enable stopping, I think, for lack of a better word, that unfortunate discharge of sewage which happens into rivers and seas when we have instances of a lot of rain. Kathy, it's probably the opposite of the situation that you're facing, is where we have a lot of rain. We have an aging wastewater infrastructure system which can't cope, which effectively means all of that affluent and sewage effectively goes into rivers of water. So a lot is being done to effectively create that surface infrastructure through sustainable urban drainage, to effectively take all of that and keep it away from beaches and rivers, for example. And that's, I think, will be something that will have a major impact on infrastructure, on quality, on bathing water, etc., over the coming 10 years.
Okay, Kathy, your shot at positivity here, or not necessarily.
Samir raises an interesting thing on the SUDs, because SUDs are quite a big issue for us in the informal settlements, because informal settlements have very limited infrastructure, certainly in terms of drainage and the sewerage as well. So they flood in the winter, and often many of them are built in, because they're informal, they're on floodplains and in areas that naturally collect water. So SUDs are a big issue as well. It's one of the many things that the city is actually trying to roll out. An interesting thing for us as well is we're starting to see quite a lot of growth in urban farming in the inner city of Cape Town, which is quite an interesting, if you look at the big picture in terms of climate, that's quite interesting, because it means that, you know, fruit and vegetables are actually grown in the city bowl, granted in a different kind of environment, but you're saving a lot on carbon emissions in that they don't need to be trucked or trained into the urban areas. So you actually start, it starts to alleviate issues around food scarcity and that kind of thing as well. So
yeah,
that's
vertical farming, a huge potential, but such a fascinating evaluation in terms of, you know, how much are you saving in terms of transportation, all of the other aspects that comes into it, because certainly from some respects, it's not a very good system, but this is very good.
So that's a research project that's waiting to be done for somebody to actually, you know, work out what is the carbon impact for every apple that you eat in the day, if you follow from source to table. I would imagine that the carbon impact of that is quite significant. And all those vacant buildings, what if, I'm asking questions here, what if vacant existing buildings in urban areas can be converted effectively for hydroponic farming in our inner cities, that would actually then resolve, you know, quite a lot of, well, certainly for us in Africa anyway, it would resolve big issues around food scarcity and that kind of thing. And then your food source becomes less reliant on the climate, because you could actually closely control the climate within the.
We're coming very close to the end here, and before I wrap up, I just want to give you each an opportunity in a very, very quick way to just say, you know, are you optimistic? Do you think we're moving in the right direction, or is it grim times ahead? I mean, this is sort of let's all hope for the best, but maybe Kathy, you can do it, and then I'll jump back. And
okay, I'll be very quick. Yes, I'm an optimist by nature, so I believe that the solutions are within our power. We need to balance the human element. I believe that's really, really important. So it's not just the economics anymore. It's the balance of that. And we just need to be careful that as fast as we create solutions, we're not creating more problems for ourselves. So we need to be thinking about the unintended consequences of the decisions that we're making today.
Okay, and Liz, what's your thanks very much there, Kath.
Yeah, no, so I'd really like the narrative to be a bit stronger. You know, if we could have this as the decade, for example, of sustainable regeneration, I think that would really help us focus on this. You know, we could have a movement as strong as net zero on this topic, because it's an opportunity missed. And I mean, talk about opportunities, digitalization provides, that ability possibly to collaborate across sectors, across organizations. So there are plenty of opportunities out there, technologies that can help us do this, but we do need the engagement of people. So it needs to have the stakeholders at the table and all working towards the same outcome, which is for society at the end of the day.
Yeah. Samir, you got the last word here, and then we'll wrap up.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, so it's I'll agree with Liz on the 2 points there, which is to take people with you and on data. We've had, I think, Dan Hughes yesterday talk about the Real Estate Data Foundation. So there's a lot of stuff we're doing as part of that, and I sit on the advisory group for that. So I can say actually there is really good work going on. What I would say is, obviously, let's not forget this is the SDG Decade for Action, SDG 11, Sustainable and Resilient Cities, and Partnerships, SDG 17. That came up in one of the questions. I don't think we can do any of this without partnerships, but I also think we can't do this without taking people with us, because clearly, if you look at some cities around the world, people are already kind of coming out against things that cities are trying to do to look at climate action, like low traffic neighborhoods, for example, in the UK. So I think take people with you and be mindful of how you do what you do and who with.
Yeah. I want to thank the panel. I mean, I just sort of make the observation that bizarrely, I think COVID in a sense has been a bit of a watershed event, you know, one of these things that has affected the whole world and has got us thinking in a way about these issues. And I'm happy that there is sort of some positivity here. But as I say, I'd really like to thank our panel. I think we've had a great discussion, and you know, maybe we'll come back and do this later.
Thank you, John.
I really appreciated that, and so I think we're all done. Thank you again.